Hello and welcome to episode 18 of Footnotes and Fairytales with me, Damien Fox, the platform that hopes to showcase people and their stories. My guest today is currently the library manager at Warren Point Library. He has a PhD in English literature and was a lecturer in Belfast for 3 years. The library in Warren Point recently held an evening called Walking on Air to celebrate the life and work of Irish poet Seamus Heaney. It was held to mark the 10th anniversary of his passing in 2013. So please let me introduce to you today Dr. Niall Kennedy. Hi, Niall. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Damien, for the invite. Very much appreciated.
As I've said to you previously, I had been doing some research on Seamus Heaney. I'd watched a lot of archive footage, a lot of old interviews and stuff. And that's when I stumbled across something on Facebook that there was an evening being held to celebrate Heaney's life and work in Warren Point Library. And it was yourself that was effectively hosting that, giving a talk and reciting some of Heaney's work. So I felt the need then to reach out to you and ask you to come on here. But before I get to Heaney, which is obviously something of great interest to me and yourself, I want to talk about you. As I understand, you're a doctor of philosophy. You have that PhD in English literature. But what was your earlier interests? I guess as in those formative teenage years, perhaps.
Well, I was always, in love with reading. Right, I was always curious. I was always want to expand, my interests. So, like, I would have read anything. Like, early teenage years, would have been Goosebumps, Lord of the Rings, stuff like that. But also interested me in my teenage years would have been, I was obsessed with, music as well. Like classic rock, would I be like David Bowie, Queen. I was just really interested in that kind of stuff. But like, my teenage years would have been, I was very quiet, kept myself to myself. I just liked, discovering something new. Like whether it be, books or music. That would have been me in my teenage years. It's just, as I said, we've just been a bit shy, I would have said.
As it relates to school, I mean, what were your strong subjects, or what did you lean towards because you enjoyed it most?
Well, naturally enough, it would have been English literature, English language. Like, it was always pretty good, when it came to spelling and grammar. But aside from English, I love history as well. I did history right up until university. I still love history, all different kinds of history, whether it be Irish history or English. Just, like when I study literature, you find out the lives of, say, like, Seamus Heaney or W.B.H., whoever it might be. You always want to find out the context in which they wrote. So that's why I was, I'm a big, I'm fascinated by history as well. So those have been my, like, strong subjects. I was decent at maths, but I always feel like as if you had to have the brain for, English or maths. It's hard to do both, kind of thing.
Yeah. And then as it relates to university, what did you hope to do, and what did you ultimately end up doing? And was there a clear end goal in mind?
Before university, I must say that the sea change for me was whenever I was doing A levels in St. Coleman's College in Newry. So a big shout out to my former English teacher, Mr. Sloan. It was his lessons that made me realize that it was not only was it university I wanted to go to, but it was specifically English. Because in Mr. Sloan's class, what we would have done is we would have done the likes of W.B. Yeats, Shakespeare. But the important difference was that up until then, I felt like English was, you had to write down what the teacher told you what text meant. This is dramatic irony because I say it is, kind of thing. Whereas by the time of A levels, the difference was you could almost say whatever you wanted about the writer, as long as you could back it up with reference to texts. It was always, it was interesting for debate. So that's why I decided to take it on as a subject at Queen's, up in Belfast. And what I realized, whenever you go to university, about 90% of learning is self-orientated. You know what I mean? It's, you have to have the self-discipline, I believe, and the motivation to find the reader or find the writers, discover them in yourself, and actually, sit and read it. But I would say I was actually A levels that would have made me where I am today, I would say. And then, not to say like, there was great lecturers at Queen's, and like I definitely, felt like as if they helped me along the way as well.
And you mentioned one teacher in particular there. I mean, from my own experience, I would say there's probably two teachers that kind of helped shape me and the person I would become. One of them, I suppose, in A level was my English literature teacher, Mel McMahon. He's a poet from Armagh. He introduced me to theatre and poetry and things like that. So that's had a lasting impact on me. Would you say that teacher that you talked about had that same impact on you, or is it an accumulative thing with number of teachers?
Well, yeah, I would say I had great teachers at St. Coleman's College, but I would, Mr. Sloan definitely was the standout for me. And like I always tried whenever I was teaching, years later at Queen's, I always tried to just emulate that style, that approach. Just like no matter what you say about a certain text, it's like elaborate on it. Whatever it might be, just let's build upon. You always try and how do you say it? You always try and just be that teacher for someone else. Because that's the thing I've noticed in my own interactions with students is that they will say, now whenever you mentioned how I did a good presentation, that really stuck with me. And like sometimes you're like, oh, what did I even say then? It's hard to remember exactly what you said to every single person. Of course, like that as well as school. You're also brought up. I'm a person of the internet age. You know what I mean? So like you always would have YouTube and like while we do waste a lot of time watching silly videos on YouTube, you can always find like TED Talks. People really interested. Like like I wouldn't say I'm a big science buff, but the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. What I love about him is that he can take some of the most complicated things, like black holes, and just if he's trying to explain it to like as you would to like a 5-year-old, so like you always try and like extrapolate that. It's like try and explain, Shakespeare or whoever it is to a younger person,
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of touched upon it, the impact that a teacher can have in shaping young people, whether it be positively or negatively. When we move on to college, then when you graduate from Queen's, I guess, what was the next step? Was there a clear idea where you go next?
Well, not really. So my final year at Queen's, I wanted to do undergraduate. I did English and history. And what happened is that my final year, my third year of Queen's, I did this essay on Shakespeare. And the thing was, you could talk about basically anything you want to. So I decided a nice topic of suffering in King Lear, right? So I was at Christmas time of my final year, and I got a pretty good mark in it. And I was quite pleased with myself. And I can remember my first class after Christmas was with the same teacher, and I was actually late to the class, just traffic. And while we were introducing ourselves to class, the lecturer said to me, "Could you meet me after class?" And I thought, oh, this is him going to give off to me about being late for the class. So he said, "Let's go to my office." And I thought, oh my God, must be something really serious. And he says, "You did quite well in your last essay. What do you hope to do next?" And I was just sitting there like, I don't really know. And he was like, "Oh, I think you should go on further. I think you should go on for the PhD." Mm-hmm. And, one thing led to another. I went on to do the master's in English. I went on to do the PhD in English. Now, as I said, I didn't even know what would be the final step after that. I always thought I would try and get, lecturing at Queen's. I have been doing that for like on and off for the past 4 years. But, truth be told, there's a reason why, university lecturers are on strikes, put it very simply and shortly, there's not enough hours to go around for everyone,
Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always had an interest in literature. I mean, I think for my part, that stems again from, like you, A levels had that kind of impact on me. I was introduced to the likes of Hemingway, which I'm a huge fan. Then again, I was introduced to the theatre, Samuel Beckett. Brenton Behan, Sean O'Casey. And to this day, I still have a passion, and I pursue it. When I live in Switzerland now, but when I'm home, I always make a point to go to Abbey Theatre, the Lyric Theatre. No matter where I am, I continue to read. So let's say, for granted now, you're an academic, you have the PhD. Away from that, because in one respect, that's an academic path that you've chose to go down. But as it relates to your own personal passion and away from college, away from teaching, do you still have that same labor of love for literature and theatre and poetry?
Oh yes, sure. I try not to stand too far. I try not to stay too far away from literature, because I've actually ended up now, I'm the manager of Warren Point Library, and that's, I'm literally not too far from the books. I'm almost, gatekeeping it. And what's happened in the recent months is that I've been able to bring my knowledge and skills to the fore. I've, as you mentioned earlier, given a talk on writers as diverse as Seamus Heaney, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Shakespeare, and so on. But of course, like yourself, you can never lose that love of literature, and I can read, well, I like to call myself a jack of all trades when it comes to literature, because whereas from Geoffrey Chaucer in the 1300s up to Stephen King's most recent, I always have try and devour it all kind of thing, So, and you were saying there earlier about how you whenever you're home from Switzerland, you like to go to the Abbey Theatre or so on. And I would be the same, because I've never actually sat down and done a course on the American playwright Arthur Miller, but I've seen so many plays of his, in the likes of the Gate Theatre in Dublin, and so it's definitely it's a passion, not just in academia, but it's also outside of that as well.
Having achieved your PhD, how big or a defining moment was that for you personally?
Well, whenever I was graduating, this was during the height of COVID, and I suppose anything out of the ordinary during COVID would make you smile. It was so bizarre, I suppose, because you always feel like, doctor, what are you talking about, and you always make that joke, if you're going on a flight and you land on your doctor, it's like, if anyone's having a stroke, I can read them a sonnet of Shakespeare,
Yeah.
But the analogy I always kind of use, because at the end of the day, you always feel like you don't feel any smarter than you were going in sometimes. But the analogy I always use, that whenever you're doing a PhD for 4 years, right? You just, it's 80,000 words. You're just writing and writing. You keep doing it and doing it. The way I always think about it is again, use a scientific metaphor, is that if you put a frog in water and very slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice. And if you keep doing it, it actually can burn and die. Whereas if you put a frog in hot water from the beginning, the frog will freak out. And that's why I feel as if, in a way, I'm like that frog. It's year in, year out, when you're studying and writing, you start to realize you're not smart anyway, but it's just this topic, where it may be, wherever this writer is, you've been studying and writing about it for years. So remember I was saying to you earlier about how in my teenage years, I was shy, really kept myself to myself. Last thing I wanted to do was to stand up and give a presentation, right? I remember, as I said to everyone, you shouldn't really care, because if you have a class of people doing a presentation, whenever someone else is up, all you're sitting to think about, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I better not mess this up. And then you go do your talk, and everyone else is still thinking about their talk. Whenever you sit back down, you're you won't care what everyone's saying, because you're I've done my bit, right? But what happened, I was always like that. I was terrified, public speaking. But you realize that, a PhD is very isolating experience. You're locked away in your own little ivory tower for years. You can't wait to talk to anyone. So that's why you stand up in front of someone. It's I almost say lecturing is talking to yourself in public. You're surprised people want to listen to you. You're just dying to share all this which, you know, sometimes feels like useless information sometimes just to anyone, you know.
Yeah. So, with regard to the PhD, that's obviously, I would imagine, I suppose it depends how you look at it. It's the end point of a particular journey that,
Mhm.
you know, or it's the beginning of a new one. I mean, here you've
Yeah.
spent this many years in academia. Um, did you see it as as an end point, a final goal achieved, or the beginning of something new, or is it a mixture of both?
Um, Look, there's definitely been good and bad since the PhD. You know, I definitely I don't see it as the end of anything. Like for all I know, I could go back in academia. You know, whether that be a postdoc or like another PhD. I haven't entirely ruled it out. Um, but I definitely felt like in terms of it was obviously the end of the PhD project. It was like, right, finally, I can put it on a shelf. It's done. It's dusted. It's abandoned almost in a sense. You know, I'm glad I don't have to keep rewriting it. But you know, the truth be told, as well, is that there's definitely good and bad because like the good bits are obvious. Is like you have the sense of completion. You can celebrate, you know, family and friends. But the bad things are is that you don't just walk into jobs like that there, you know, right away. You know,
Mhm.
in the years since the PhD, I've worked, you know, freelance as a tutor, and you'd be surprised. Like, no joke, over the years, I've had people contact me saying, "Can you tutor me in Mandarin?" You know, Chinese, and you're like, I don't have the qualifications for this here. And it's like, and they're like offering to pay you big money for it. Like, no, look, you've got the wrong person. I won't do this. And then on the other hand, someone will be saying, you know, you applied to tutor someone in GCSE English, and they said, no, we don't think you're qualified enough. So yeah, you know, for since the PhD and during PhD, you gotta learn that you know you can't have an ego, you know, because throughout the PhD process itself, you know, you're writing chapter after chapter, and sometimes you're thinking, this is the greatest thing I've ever written, or this is like, you know, it should be locked away and burned. And then like your PhD supervisor along the way is going to tell you, you know, what's at fault almost. You know, obviously they're going to build you up. There's someone say, change this, get rid of that. And like the amount of stuff I've deleted could fill books. You know what I mean? That didn't go into the final PhD project. And the same with, you know, since the PhD, it's like you've got to realize that um, you don't just walk into a lectureship position. You don't just walk in to become, like, yeah, they talk about tenure. It just doesn't happen like that there. You got to make ends meet. You got to, as I say, you try and tutor some people. It just doesn't happen. You know, as I said, you got to learn not only self discipline, but just you got a sense of ego. It's you have to get rid of that.
So, was it inevitable that you would go on to lecture, or what were some other ideas as to what you would do with what you've accomplished? I mean, was there ever a sense that maybe creatively you wanted to write yourself, or was it in a teaching sort of framework that you saw yourself?
Well, what they do, what Queen's very helpfully do during the PhD, is that you do teach while you are still studying yourself, and that's a great experience. I say, get you out of the house. Something as simple as that. There, get you out of the house, get you away from the library, get away from your own studies. And you know, I was thinking, oh yeah, this is. There'll be more of this at the end, but sometimes that just doesn't happen. But when you talk about other creative ventures, yeah, I do dabble in writing myself. You know, um, for the past 3 years or so now, I've actually been trying to write a play about the Phoenix Park murders in Dublin, which happened in 1882, and it's just been an on and off. It started off as a COVID project, but I've just been trying to get people to look at it. Like I've just trying to throw everything but the kitchen sink at. I'm almost like trying to steal bits from different Irish writers, a little bit of Shakespeare here and there. But yeah, you know, I like that. That'd be my creative aspect, and um, as well as that, I do love teaching as well. You know, I do love getting up. I say it doesn't matter whether it's to an academic audience or a general audience. I do love just sharing and debating different writers as well.
Yeah, that's something I've always attempted to do, and I guess in many ways I'm kind of fearful of the need to write because I'm afraid that I'll fall short of what I hope to achieve. So I find myself more often than not actually not writing because I'm too fearful. I suppose not only of falling short of the standard I hope, but of being judged for not being good, you know.
Mhm.
So that's always a bit of stumbling block for me. If we move on to your current position, you're the manager of Warren Point Library. When you come into a role like that, what do you hope to bring to it?
Well, as I said, I feel like as if the Beatles just released a new song, right?
I heard that
And
today. Yeah.
yeah, right. And well, well, just put Ringo aside one bit, right? But you have McCartney and Harrison. Everyone's trying to write songs. Everyone's trying to bring stuff to the table, and that's what I try and do with Warren Point Library. I'm like, with me and my team, we're like, what can we bring to the table? And obviously, my skill sets would be literature, and that's why I was hoping to give talks. We have many great artists in the library, and I'm just trying to, encourage that as well. Just what can we actually bring to the fore, And I'm just trying to, learn the ropes, because it was baptism by fire. You have to, I came in there and I've only been there for 6 months, and I've just been trying to, what day by day approach, as you were saying there about how you don't want to fall short. Well, I try to keep this mentality from writing as well as Warren Point Library or whatever it might be. You always just got to tell yourself, what can I actually just do today?
Mm-hmm.
Today. Forget about tomorrow's. Whenever I wake up, what can I do different today? And that might be simple, Warren Point Library, something simple as, let's get some Halloween decorations up. Did you get that done? Are they the best Halloween decorations ever? Maybe not, but I was able to do that today. And that's what you have to try and tell yourself, is that, as you were saying, you're stumbling in your writing, you think you're going to fall short. Whatever it might be, whether it's writing or managing, what I try and tell myself, take writing for example, is that, like, whatever I write in a day, you tell yourself half of this is going to be scrapped. And that might seem as like, what, I thought I was a better writer. Just no. Just tell yourself, whatever I write today, half of that will not see the light of day. And it gives you a sense of freedom. It's sort of like, well, if half of this people aren't going to see, I'll just keep writing that. And then it gives you, a chance to be more bold in a sense. It's the same with whatever it might be. Managed library, it's like, people aren't going to see what I'm going to do here. So let's move to display. People might notice it. But something simple as that there is like, well, I just, give it a go kind of thing. But that's why I said, to go back to again, I always just like try and encourage each one of us at the library just to, whatever your skills or talents are, put them on display. I'm always trying to think outside the boat, just trying to, encourage. I've been inviting people to give talks as well. Like, a lot of people have said to me, yep, they're very interested in. And it's the same mentality where it's like, I email people, introducing myself and saying, would you like to give a talk at Warren Point Library? And you think they may never reply to you. They may say, God, no, how dare you invite? But it's like, so what? At least I tried it. I've been very lucky in that regard so far.
I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I mean, I stumbled across that post on Facebook that, was talking about the evening that would celebrate Seamus Heaney's life and work. And it's quite aptly named Walk In on Air. I was frustrated initially because I wanted to go. And that's something that I would love to go and be a part of. But obviously, I'm not at home at the moment, so I wasn't able to. What I find nice about what you're doing is that you're trying to engage more with let's say an audience. You're trying to bring people into the library. I mean, especially in this digital age where you find that libraries are probably seen in some regard by the newer generation as archaic and dusty old rooms with dusty old books. How do you overcome that challenge and try to engage more in order to get people back into libraries, get back into reading?
It's definitely a difficult challenge. And of course, you have to accept the fact that people do consume literature in different ways. There's online methods, there's Kindle, and there's different apps and websites that library users can go to discover the latest books. So you got to remember sometimes that just because people aren't physically in the library, people are still reading.
Hmm.
Of course, there's so many uh, generational, long-term trends in people not going to library, especially people in their 20s and 30s. And again, you just gotta feel like what can you actually do in your own little capacity. So you're trying to get the popular books. You're trying to even do things just differently, like to get people in the library. I've proposed this idea of game night. Where people bring Monopoly sets, Jenga, something. Just get them in the library. It's almost like you're trying to get the man. It's like, oh, and by the way, we have these books by such and such writer. Would you like one? You know, because people, for a lot of people, that the library would just be it's their only sense of a social setting.
Hmm.
For especially for older people. But for younger people, it's just like keep battering at that door. Keep trying to give talks. Usually spreads by word of mouth. For like as you said, people see your posts up on Facebook. Um, just different events. You just try and think outside the box too.
Yeah.
We have very recently I have like arts and crafts, which are very popular. Again, you get people in the library and it's like, well, you're doing arts and crafts as well. It's like, well, by the way, there's other different forms of arts as well within these these pages. So it's just
I,
like different things.
I seen a picture online, and it was obviously a picture from the evening, kind of from the back of the room, looking up toward you speaking. I mean, it's very poignant when you look at the demographic that you were talking to. It was quite an older audience, um, which I mean could be for many reasons. But how would you look to get younger generation, to engage more with the likes of Seamus Heaney and take an interest?
I do think you have to get them while they're young, anyways. I do feel like as if at school, you know, it'd be worth even visiting schools to discuss um, writers. You need to show how it can be relevant to your life,
Hmm.
and you don't want to try and force it down people's throats. For all people just mightn't get Seamus Heaney, but I do feel like there's a writer out there for everyone. You know, um, and of course, some people it's just in this day and age, it's all about media gratification, isn't it? Like I think this here is one of the best and worst inventions in the world because we have sort of lost sight of deferred gratification. Like it takes a long time to read books in most
Hmm.
cases, and this here is like awful for the distracting you. Like I would say, remember I mentioned about how the sea change for me was A levels. Well, I was whenever I was 18, I didn't really have a smartphone, and I can remember that whether it be English literature or history books, I was getting through about like 10 books in a week, easy. I remember there'd be nights here in this very room where I'd be reading Irish history books cover to cover because I didn't have any distractions. Whereas now,
Hmm.
I will admit, I think we're all addicted to the phones. I admit that number's definitely been halved. I wouldn't get through as many books in a week. I wouldn't say solely through the mobile phone. Life gets in the way too. It's obviously a lot freer as a teenager, but I definitely would be one to say of the perils of distraction in this day and age, and just try and encourage young people, just take that time to switch off, like literally switch off from anything electronic, any of the phones, and just find whatever it is you're interested in, whether it's crime, romance, or any of the classics of literature. Just dip in, and again, it's what can you do today. I'm not going to tell you to read the entire poetry of Seamus Heaney or all of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace in one day, but it's like, can you read a page? Great. Tomorrow, can you read 2 pages? And so on. It's just little by little. Can you just expand your horizons that little bit. You know, it's, again,
Yeah.
it goes back to that mantra. What can you do today? But I do feel like you try and need to you do need to get them while they're young, anyways. You know, that their
Mhm.
interest. And it can be in the most unlikely of places. You know, whatever writer grabs you, like that's the thing I think is key, is that if you're halfway interested in literature and a writer grabs you, it's almost like get out of that person's way, because they'll just keep reading as much as they can of that writer. You won't have to direct them, you know.
Yeah. I wanted to understand your relationship to Seamus Heaney, um, and why. I mean, obviously, it's 10 years since his passing, so it's a wonderful opportunity to mark that anniversary. So that would explain in part why you would choose Seamus Heaney. But obviously, I would imagine there's a personal element. You must enjoy his poetry or have a keen interest in the man. So, what was the reason behind it?
Well, I can remember as far back as primary school. You know, it's almost like a rite of passage where everyone from the north has to encounter Seamus Heaney. And primary school, we had to recite Heaney's poem "Blackberry Pickin'," you
Hmm.
know, and it almost first experience in it in primary school. The fact that as a class we were recite line by line, it almost in a weird way, it was almost like a religious experience, because you would say your morning prayers, and then you would say, you know, late August, given the heavy rain and sun. It was almost like another prayer you would be saying. Um, but of course, you know, my love of literature, you know, whether it be English, Irish literature, you have to come across Seamus Heaney. You can't ignore him. You know,
Hmm.
like um, you know, as many people would say, he'd be the greatest, you know, Irish poet since W.B. Yeats. And you know, I even know some similarities between his life and mine. The fact that, you know, we both were educated at Queen's and also end up educating at Queen's. You
Hmm.
know, so whenever you have a poet, you share some life experiences, and the fact that, like, whenever I first encountered him, he was obviously still alive. You know, so like it's so weird. Like, as a matter of fact, what I find so strange is that, like, whenever I be like teaching Shakespeare or Yeats, you know, you're dealing with people hundreds of years ago, whereas um you mentioned there was quite a few older people at the crowd and Warren Point Library. So after the talk, people came up to me and they said, like, you know, you mentioned that Seamus Heaney uh, was lecturing at St. Joseph's College. He lectured me. So I was talking to people who were lectured by Seamus Heaney, and it's like, you know, whenever you're doing Shakespeare, you never have anyone come up to you and say, "Oh, I know the man." It's impossible, you know. So like, it's, you know, that's really astounding. Is that, you know, he's so close to me in many ways. Not only, you know, almost geographically, you know, he was from, you know, County Derry. He's close, but you know, as you said, he's only passed away these 10 years. You know, his family are still alive, and as I said, it's impossible if, you know, you're doing a PhD in English literature, or even if you just have a passing interest in Irish literature, you can't ignore the man. You know, what, you know, you might have your complaints or whatever, but you have to study him. You know.
And what was the experience like? I would imagine in having to give a talk about Seamus Heaney, you would have to try and understand the man and his life a bit better. I mean, what in particular, when reading about him, was there anything particularly poignant or anything that struck a chord with you that I guess resonates?
Yeah. Um, you know, many of his talks are on YouTube, and even how he looks, he always has this calming influence. You know, um, you know, Yates was always like the finger point, like, you know, I'm always smarter than you, kind of thing, in a way. Whereas whenever you look at James Heaney, it's just like, what I love about him is this common influence, and you know, a lot of people say how he seemed to have time for everyone. Like, you could have come up to him and just talked about anything, you know. And what I love about Heaney, what's struck with me, is that he was definitely self-taught for the most part, you know. Like, at school, they would have introduced him to some writers, like bits of, like, you know, the classics like Virgil or something, but he would have went off and learned Virgil by heart. Like everything the man wrote. I always found like this idea of being self-taught is something to be admired. And again, as I was saying to you earlier about how I love teaching. Heaney, yes, he resigned his post from Queen's early on, but if you read his lectures or you watch his lectures on YouTube, it's astounding. He definitely was one of the all-time great lecturers. Like I really encourage people to check it out. Like one of his best lectures was on where he compares the poetry of W.B. Yeats and Philip Larkin. And whenever I first read it, I was like sat reeling for weeks. In a way, it's just that like he just was able to just come across ideas that you never thought of before. But of course, Heaney's life is different in so many ways to mine, in that during his life was obviously a difficult period in Northern Ireland. As always, you got to ask yourself, what would you have done during those years? It's like the thing that strikes me about doing research about Heaney is that he would have admitted it himself pretty early on, is that he was so lucky at the start in that his first collection, Death of Naturalists, was, lauded and like it sold very well. Like that those years between 1964 and 66, everything seemed to go right for him. Is that he has his first poetry collection, he gets married, he has kids. It's just like, but what came with that though was whenever he had the troubles coming, I was like, oh, you're the poet for our tribe now. And he's just like back, and I was like, I write poetry for myself. I don't want to speak for anyone. It's just like you gotta ask yourself, what would I have done? It's like it's yes, it's great for success, but there were pitfalls, and like it's interesting to see not only how he negotiates for that, but how he actually puts his negotiations on display in poetry. He says like he talks about how someone from Sinn Féin says, "When the F are you going to write for us?" And his response is, I never did. I always write for myself. If I ever choose to, it'll be at my own, my own leisure kind of thing. So yes, I mean, I'm struck by so many similarities, but I think the overall thing for me that really stands out is that he just seemed to have time for everyone. Just time to help. Like it was interesting. I was just talking to people who came up to me after in one point. I was just saying how, Heaney would have, whenever he was teaching in his younger days, he would almost ignore the class plan. He'd just say, let's talk about imagery, something like that. They just throw it out there. Again, this idea of debates, just something. So what is an image? How apt can an image be? How does each poet create this image in your mind? Whenever you say, if I were to say to you, an old man fell off a chair, your picture of an old man in a chair is completely different from mine. But we both understand the same thing, but it's your old man, you have a particular person in your head, same as me. And the chair might be different, might be wooden chair, might be like a swivel chair. But it's just like, again, all these different just something so fascinating from something so simple, this idea of an image, and he could have an hour's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked a lot about it. For me, again, there's that warmth and accessibility to Heaney that obviously for many poets we don't have. I mean, when you talk about Yeats, there's not a wealth of material online or video. I think we're very fortunate that we have all of that. So Heaney is accessible to us, but again, he made himself accessible. I'd watched I guess a talk, not necessarily a lecture, between Roy Foster and Heaney's daughter Catherine, and this, I guess, relates to his first work, Death of a Naturalist, and she talked about the fact that most people had the impression with Death of a Naturalist that Heaney arrived fully formed as a poet, but there obviously was a tremendous amount of work to get to that point that people perhaps lose sight of. I guess with the Troubles and how that relates to Heaney, an unenviable position for a poet, whether it be nationalist or unionist, to try and thread that particular line tactfully, which I think he did a marvelous job of. I'd watched something perhaps some of his early stuff, where he was asked, because I guess with a poet and a successful poet, there's a platform. He's got a speakerphone. I suppose naturally it was something that nationalists hoped that he would use, for his tribe. But he had said that poetry wasn't good as a means of accusation, which I suppose naturally when you think about it, I can understand that completely, But like I said, he was tactful and masterful. I think he was measured, and to have been put in a position like that, and to have handled it as he did, speaks to the man. When we look at his poetry, something that I had come across time and time again was this word of evasion or evasive, where he didn't want to, and as it relates particularly to the Troubles, he didn't want to talk about it directly. He had a means to talk about it indirectly. So much of his poetry, I suppose, is layered. You have that very top superficial layer, but there's so much more beneath. When we talk about Heaney the poet and Heaney the man, what are some of the things? And you've probably touched upon it already, but like when you look at the man and the poet, what for you? What's to be admired about him, like in terms of his character qualities?
Well, as a man, we've been talking about how he seems just so accessible. He never got big headed, It didn't matter. Like, as I said, at one point he's teaching at Queen's, then he's professor at Harvard for many years, Oxford, the Nobel Prize of Literature. It didn't go to his head. He was always still our Seamus in the end, In fact, from a lot of people still call him by his first name. You always feel like as if he's a friend. And, I feel like another similarity between he and the man, it's also in his poetry, and something I always relate to, is that, from Death of Naturalist to his last collection, he always talks about his childhood experiences. Something so innocent as I mentioned the poem Blackberry Picking. He always had this eye for what he did as a child in the rural life. He liked to elevate the labor of on the farm, and that always just struck me because I basically live in the middle of nowhere beside farms, and it takes you back to this idea of idyllic childhood. Obviously bees weren't around. You didn't care. There was no clocks in a sense. You were just happy in your own little world, and that also speaks to his poetry because in his poetry he is creating his own little worlds.
There's something incredibly wholesome about that childhood experience. Incredibly idyllic, and I think a lot of people, not that they relate to it, but are certainly drawn to it.
Yeah, but again, it is multi-layered as well because in his early poem, probably one of his most famous poems, Digging, where he talks, the great thing about Heaney is that he might be talking about his father digging in the field, but he's also talking about digging into the roots for poetry. And there's that great lines where he says, between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests snug as a gun. Now, of course, it's beautiful on the tongue, but of course, in the lead up to the Troubles, of course, people are going to read into this, snug as a gun. There's this hint of aggression. There's this hint of violence. And even in poems as innocent as Blackberry Picking, where he talks about how it's great and all going out picking the blackberries, but there's little hints of there's danger because he talks about the briar scratching himself as he's going out. And then, of course, there's that inevitable disappointment, as he says, where the blackberries will not stay, they will eventually rot. There's this sense of too much of a good thing as well. So there's always this, there's little multi-layers. There's, Heaney's poetry is multi-layered. Um, but yeah, that's the other great thing too about his poetry is that he makes his self doubts, as we were talking there about, you know, can he be the voice of his country and whatever that might be. He puts his self doubts on the page. He makes strength out of weakness, for lack of a better word. You know, he's saying like he puts his tentative uh, poet. He puts his tentative powers on display. He's revealing you all of his own self doubts. He's taking you into his own mind and his poetry. He's not afraid to show you how people might accuse him of being a coward because in 1972, at the height of the Troubles, he took his family out of Belfast into County Wicklow.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, many people at the time said, "Oh, you're abandoning your people." Like, again, it's one of the things. What would you have done at that time? Of course, you can debate, you can possibly see a bit of both sides, but if you and your own family, if you could have got out of a conflict society, would you have done the same thing? And he's able to answer years later. He's able to go back to that their idea that, am I a coward? Am I not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to say, or to answer. What would I have done in similar circumstances? But I mean, I think he made it very clear that it was the right decision for his family. There was something that struck me in researching Heaney, and in particular that move from Belfast to Wicklow. In one of the older interviews, he was asked, at what point did you see yourself as the poet? And he said it was effectively not by chance, but he had gone to Wicklow and relocated the family. And part of the relocation is that he would register his children with the local school. So he had gone in to register his daughter for the local school in Wicklow that his kids would go to. And part of the process at that time was you'd fill out the necessary paperwork. And he had said that a large part of the paperwork, administrative side of things back then still would have been in Irish. So I think he had said, without effectively asking him, the headmaster, in filling out the part of the form that asked for the father's profession, the principal had gone ahead and effectively filled in Irish poet. And Heaney says, he could have put professor, but for whatever reason, he put the Irish for poet. And it was realistically from that point forward that he started seeing himself as the poet, which is a relatively trivial thing to happen. But for him, that was kind of a line in the sand. And from that point forward, he would see himself as the poet, which I just thought was incredibly interesting.
Because also to that point is that it was someone else who put it down for him. Again, it's always like, all he did, up until that point was put poetry collections out there. And people have said, right, you're for our side now. You're speaking for this country, right? And if you compare him with, likes of W.B. Yeats, or who basically said, I'm going to shape this country, through my poetry. I'm going to mold this country. The difference is when we were talking about Heaney the man and the poet, I have loved to have, spoken with Heaney, whereas with W.B. Yeats, I don't think you would like to have met him,
No,
definitely, yeah.
There's something I guess, having talked to you kind of offline. I mean, I've always been aware of Yeats. He's not someone that I've studied at great length. I mean, I think the most striking thing for me about him in particular, and I kind of got this quote from an early age, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, so forgive me if I don't get it 100% correct, but the quote being, to think where man's glory most begins and ends, and I'll say my glory was I had such friends. And in my eyes, if he had written nothing else bar that, he was a master, because it's so elegant. And from that point forward, Yeats had always stayed with me for that alone. But I've gone away and I haven't talked to you briefly and kind of looked into the man, and incredibly interesting to say the least. And some of the things that he was privy to or interested in were a little unsettling as it relates to mysticism and spirituality and other worlds, and obviously his sexual proclivities and different things like that. But I saw some parallels with Heaney and Yeats in so much as their formative years. I mean, when you look at Yeats, they talk about his formative years in Sligo, visiting with his mother's family. And that time, I think in particular, there's a point there called Ross's Point, you know. And I've just got a brief quote as it relates to it, but he attributes, you know, and he talks about the Sligo sea cliffs. They were what give tongue to his poetry. Equally, when you look at Heaney, I guess you can say the same as it relates to Mossbawn and that upbringing amongst farm life. But when we look at Yeats, what for you interests you about him?
I think the best way to describe Yeats is that he's almost like Superman. And what I mean by that is that his poetry, he's basically Superman. He's like the strongest one there is, right? He's just knocking everyone out of his way. But he also has his alter ego, Clark Kent, you know, who can't get Lois Lane and is almost like a bumbling idiot. Where that's basically Yeats was his, you mentioned his sexual proclivities. Is like, if anyone who knows Yeats, they know the name Maud Gonne, who was this, you know, Irish nationalist, even though she was originally from England, who he basically pined for about the guts of 30 years. And he must have proposed to her about, well, countless times. And at one point, he even proposed to her 12-year-old daughter. So, and you were mentioning that wonderful quote about friends. Well, yes, Yeats also was a member of the Golden Dawn, and what they would have done is they would have summoned demons like into their kitchens almost. Whatever came to Yeats and friendships, the thing you realize is that he always wanted to be the leader of the group. So he always like formed his own little sect of the Golden Dawn. And whenever people started doing things their own way, he was like, right, let's stop this. I'm going to create a new sect until I'm the leader. So he always wanted to be the leader of his friends. So those might be some of the less positive things about Yeats. But what struck me, again, this brings us back to my A levels, was that it was so remarkable. So like we happened to be just studying Yeats. And the thing was, we did his poetry from 1886. So he's only like 21 years of age, right up. We went right through the poetry he was writing on his deathbed, literally on his deathbed. He was writing within weeks. So you felt like as if you got the length and breadth of the man through his words, you know, and words that stick with you, you know, from his early poetry, The Stolen Child, where, you know, come away, O human child, to the waters in the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. That's locked in there. You know, it's a rhythm. It's just, it's something almost religious in it. You know, his poetry sticks with you. I swear, it's some of the most remarkable poetry I've ever come across. You know, September 1913, romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave. That refrain, again, it sinks into your brain almost, and all these years later, it is stuck with me. And again, you can love him or loathe him for this, but you know, as we were mentioned with Heaney, when he was alive, you know, Northern Ireland was going through troubled times, and you mentioned the word evasion. You know, with Yeats, he certainly never evaded. He was always at the forefront. Like he knew all the key players during the formation of the Irish Free State, you know, and the build up, you know, from the 1916 rising up until like, you know, he himself became a senator in a newly formed Irish Free State. He knew everybody, you know. He was always involved. Like you mentioned the Abbey Theatre. He helped set up the Abbey Theatre. So you can always say he was a man of business as well. That's something you can admire him. You know, you don't want to take his dictatorial approach. He was always like, I want to be the leader of Abbey Theatre. I need to be the leader of such and such group. But I will admire him that he never evaded anything. He always would go there full frontal almost. And as I said, his poetry stuck with me. And yeah, I always I give him the benefit of the doubt in a sense. I know like he tried to shape Ireland through his poetry, and we can almost laugh at it in a sense. But I admire his grand projects in a sense. You know, we can poke holes at it, but you almost sit back and look at yourself and say, what are you doing? Could we through virtue of his own poetry, that's how he ended up becoming Senator in Irish Free State. You know what I mean? It's almost like, what have you done in your life? We can laugh at others, but it gives a sense of humility as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know a poet, but I'd known less so, I guess, the impact outside of poetry that he had on Ireland and helping to shape it. His was very much a cultural revolution as opposed to an armed rebellion. I'd watched a documentary there with Bob Geldof, and he had said that it was ultimately Yeats's revolution that won out. That was the revolution of the mind. But he was a fervent nationalist his whole life. I mean, you talked about John O'Leary there. He was the founder of the ARB that played such a huge and instrumental part in the 1916 Rising. But again, Yeats's impact was a cultural revolution, not an armed revolution, which he's had a remarkable impact. I mean, you touched upon the Abbey Theatre, which he helped found, but he also helped found a ballet theatre, National Ballet Theatre and other things. And I think, and I don't have the person in mind that I'm quoting, but they had effectively said, without Yeats, there would be no modern Ireland or Free State. So, I mean, yes, his poetry is incredible and elegant, but he's done so much more, which I wasn't aware of, but I wanted to ask you in particular, as it relates to kind of the mystic and the supernatural and that element of Yeats. When you have someone as gifted as him, how do you reconcile someone that is a logical, rational being, but equally believes in the supernatural and the mystic? Like, it seems hard to believe that the same man has those same beliefs.
I suppose, well, W.H. Auden, another great poet, he wrote a poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. And he says, "You were silly like the rest of us. Your gift survived it all." So I think what I was trying to say there is that your poetic gift has survived your silliness. So we can stand back, and say, "Oh, how did Yeats believe in fairies?" And we can laugh at it. But in this day and age, many people are still religious, and again, if you sit and question, Christian, man walking on water, how silly, man comes back, from the dead after 3 days, because, never happens, right? So, you can't sit and laugh about that, but at the same time as well, is that he was able to take these fairies and use it as an imaginative resource. He was able to say, like, in a weird way, this idea of supernatural beings can almost help explain his poetry. Is that, like, he was almost gifted this poetry from somewhere else. It's like we can sit here and, debate where does inspiration come from. Like we can sit here and ask, what actually is the point of dreams? When we go to sleep at night, what is the point of them? We're talking. You mentioned, logic or rational. Some dreams might have special meanings if you go down the Freudian route, but some dreams, according, for us, are just nonsense. They happen to us nonetheless. So, with Yeats, when it comes to the fairies, it's like that was his interests. Of course, there are some arguments as to whether or not he was fully committed to the idea of fairies. Maybe it was just a social gathering for all we know. It's just for him to meet, the Glorian with his friends. But you can't deny his poetic gifts nonetheless. And I suppose that, that leads into that debate of separating the man from the artist as well. That's a debate you can get lost in the woods.
That's something that I've always had an interest in, and maybe you can relate to it. But when you have an artist, poet, playwright, whatever it might be, they create these very perfect, in many ways, outlets of creativity, whether it be a play, a poem, a sonnet, whatever. But the man or the woman, there's human frailty and folly, which is very much at odds with the perfection that they've put on stage or in a book. I mean, when you look at Yeats, what an incredibly interesting man to begin with. I'd looked in and more recently tried to understand the mysticism and that part of his world, which I can't relate to, but again, it's easy in hindsight looking back and poking holes in somebody's belief system. I mean, if you put anything under the microscope, you're going to find fault, of course. So, I mean, if we look at the likes of Heaney and Yeats, Ireland has 4 poet laureate or Nobel laureates, 2 of which we've mentioned. Who else for you is of particular interest and why?
Outside of Irish literature, or
no, outside of Heaney and the likes of W.B. Yeats. I mean, who else is an interest of yours? I mean, I've enjoyed Brendan Behan, my Red Borstal Boy, and then I've seen stage plays that kind of look at the latter part of his life and stuff. So I have an interest in him. Obviously, I've seen some of O'Casey's plays in Dublin and stuff. But is there anything else that you've seen that interests you about Irish literature?
Oh, well, Oscar Wilde. I definitely think he's known. He only wrote 1 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a great Gothic story. And I suppose, with Oscar Wilde, he's sort of like, well, he's up there with Winston Churchill in that he's known for, all his quotes, and sometimes the quotes that he misattributed to him. And that's, his wit is not undeniable. But I think, aside to Oscar Wilde, that isn't really talked about, I think it should be talked about more, is that he was such a brilliant critic. Like, I mean, if you read like his criticism called The Decay of Lying, or his dialogues between these 2 people, and like how they whatever it might be, they criticize modern literature or modern theater. He was such a great critic, and also to a great work of art of his would be called De Profundis, which is Latin for From the Depths, is what he wrote whenever he was in prison, whenever his homosexuality came to light. That there is, again, a great work of art, in that you have this man literally, rotting in jail, saying like, I had it all and I threw it away. There's threw away. You have this man saying, I've made mistakes in my life, and he's writing to his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, and it's remarkable when he says, like, yes, you helped become, the source of my downfall, but I went head first into it. I went along with this here, and it's just remarkable to see someone just being so honest, And again, a great poem of his is the Ballad of Reading Jail. He says, man kills the thing he loves, because it's a poem about this man who strangled his wife, who was actually in prison at the same time as Oscar Wilde. Again, if people listen, they should check out this other side of Oscar Wilde, because when they think about this flamboyant, man about town in front of the theater, but it's the quiet side of Oscar Wilde. It's that there has always spoke to me. It's like his attention to a man who has suffered and is able to write truthfully about his suffering. And again, despite all he's going through, the 2 years of hard labor, you'll notice in De Profundis, he's still using quotes from nature. He's still using quotes from Wordsworth or Keats to help express his pain. So despite everything, despite having lost everything, the resources of literature is with him nonetheless. You know, um, as well as that, too, the other titan of Irish literature who I sort of have a love-hate relationship with would be James Joyce. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I gave a talk about him as well at Bloomsday. The thing I find so remarkable about Joyce is that his work, his early work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is that the first half of that novel, as I was reading it, it was almost like I was reading about myself, because you have this very shy boy. It's basically about Joyce's own upbringing, but they changed the name. We talked about this character Stephen, but it's basically about Joyce's own life. But the first half of the novel, you have this young boy in secondary school who's shy, unsure of himself, and also quite blind, right? In one class, his glasses breaks, and a teacher asks Joyce to read, with the character Stephen, to read from the board. And because Stephen can't, he gets shouted at, you know? And I just like, oh my God, this is something I can relate to. Well, of course, as you carry on through the novel, the character Stephen slowly turns into what people would be put off by Joyce, is he's basically a know-it-all. You know, he almost like Yeats, where he has his group of friends and he's quoting Lord Byron, he's quoting all these obscure poets, and he's just showing people off through his intellectual prowess, where he ends up saying, "I want to leave Ireland for the continent to create the uncreated conscience of my race." And you're just like, who is this guy? How do we get from the kid unsure of himself who couldn't speak in the classroom to this guy way off to France to become this poet extraordinaire? So those I would say. I think we mentioned Samuel Beckett as well. Of
Yeah,
course, yeah.
I've had an interest in Beckett. I seen, and again, it was the same teacher that introduced me. We went to the Lyric Theatre in Belfast and saw Waiting for Godot. As it relates to Joyce, I first and foremost, I wasn't aware that he was buried in Switzerland. I only learned that this year. He's buried in a cemetery just outside Zurich, next to the Zurich Zoo. But inside Zurich, they have a James Joyce Centre. It's run by this elderly academic old guy with white hair, and you can see idiosyncrasies in his manner and the clothes he wears. But I mean, they've photos on the walls where he's met, the president, Higgins and all, people of note from Ireland that have come and visited the James Joyce Centre. They've got like artifacts that belong to him, which is a wonderful thing. The first edition books, again, which is incredible. But I guess in researching Joyce a little bit more, I'd understood, and this is coming from his wife, after he had died, they were going to bury him next to the zoo in Zurich. And she said quite lovingly and aptly that he would be buried close enough to hear the lions roar. He always enjoyed that. But I'd also learned that, which is interesting. I mean, I like the art as much, but I'm much more interested in the artist. So as much as I can appreciate Heaney's poetry, my interest is in the man and what shaped his work, So I'd read a little bit more about Joyce, but at that point in time, it was quite common to bury the person with a little glass pane on the lid of the coffin where you could still see their face, which I'd never heard of before. But it's rumored that when he was being lowered into the coffin, his wife had said, "Oh my God, James, you look wonderful," or "You look beautiful," And it's those things, it's those little nuggets of information that I wouldn't necessarily have that pique my interest in the person. And that's what effectively I'm in the pursuit of when I look at these people. But Beckett's another interesting one. I mean, he, like Joyce, he had gone off and left Ireland to live on the continent. I mean, a lot of Joyce or Beckett's work is written in French. I mean, I think Ireland at that time, and you would understand this a whole lot better than I would, given your background and understanding of literature. I mean, it was a very repressive society, dominated by the church. And these people like Joyce and Beckett felt they couldn't work in such environment. And they had to sort of cast off the shackles of that conservative culture to truly be themselves. Which I found incredibly interesting. And particularly, and not that we shouldn't celebrate Joyce, because he is Irish, but in many respects, and it got to a point where he never set foot on Ireland again for a large part of his life. He in a sense turned his back on it, but yet we hold him so dear. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, the remarkable thing about Joyce, I would say, is that he would probably consider himself a European writer. You know, his love of Italian literature, like Dante's Inferno. You know, um, his knowledge of the English canon of literature, from Shakespeare to John Milton, right through to Charles Dickens. You know, in a work such as Ulysses, which can sometimes be almost incomprehensible, there's certain chapters where Joyce can parody like nearly every style of English literature. Has said, going as far back as Old English, and you just have to admire the audacity. Like sometimes you can think, well, you're going if you're like from an editor's point of view, you must feel like, Jesus, you could have scrapped that. You wouldn't have lost anything. But from studying someone's style, it's like, you just have to admire the audacity, like just like, yeah, I can do this. The independent, with Joyce, it's this independence, like you were saying there about how Ireland was repressive, and I suppose that goes back to Yeats in a sense, because you mentioned the Bob Geldof documentary, where Geldof says that Yeats's cultural revolution won out as opposed to like the violent revolution, say, of 1916. And I think you have to remember is that W.B. Yeats was from a Protestant background, Church of Ireland, but he still was nonetheless a committed nationalist. He was still, this idea of Ireland should be culturally separate from England, even though he still wrote in English. And if you look at the history of the Irish Republic, especially, in the years, say, of Eamon de Valera, like they literally did bow down to the Catholic Church. They would by the Catholic Church. And that's not saying against, Roman Catholicism or anything, but it's just like the separation of church and state simply wasn't there. And we know of like recent scandals of, how Ireland, treated women, especially women who had children out of wedlock, whereas people like Joyce, they were able to, forward thinking at the very least. As I said, they're very much a European state of mind. And to show you how repressive Ireland was, whenever I would teach Joyce, I would ask people do they think Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses was banned in Ireland because it has, very graphic descriptions of all different features of the human body, shall we say, right? And all different functions of the human body. People would say, naturally, yeah, of course it was banned in Ireland. And you turn around and say, no. The actual fact was they never thought to publish it in Ireland. They never were conceived to publish it in the first place. So it never had to be banned. It was never going to happen. So yeah, technically speaking, it never was banned in Ireland, because I said they never would have considered publishing it in the first place. That's how repressive they were. So you don't need to go to the bother of censoring it. No one's going to look to publish this. Mm-hmm. That's why Joyce, a bit like Beckett, had to publish in Paris originally. So yeah, you can admire that independence, that independent frame of mind. And of course, it's up to yourself, I suppose, how far you want to take that. Because you can perhaps lose a run of yourself in some cases, like Joyce or Yeats.
Yeah, I've not read Ulysses, and I'll be open and admit it, but I've owned a copy of Ulysses for about 20 plus years. I bought it when I was at the Queen's University bookshop. It's no longer there. I guess in trying to understand the greatest novel ever written, I'd Googled it and all of these wonderful things, and Ulysses inevitably would be in the top one or two always. So in my mind, I'd always put it on a pedestal, and understood it to be this master of literature. So to this day, I've still not read it, and I don't know when I plan to read it, but it's something on my bucket list. But I'd read something, and this kind of relates to the Great War. Very often you would have seen, perhaps in advertisements or newspaper advertisements at the time, you would have seen this little depiction of a young boy kneeling beneath his grandfather and asking, "Granddad, what did you do during the Great War?"
Mm.
And then there was this, I guess, parody where a child is asking James Joyce, "What did you do during the Great War?" And his answer was, "I wrote Ulysses," as if
Yeah.
it had the same standing as someone that fought. You know, he put it up there, which I thought was quite interesting. And again, more. I mean, I've read some of Joyce's work. You know, Dubliners and The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But again, there's something about the person, and that goes to Heaney, to Yeats, to anybody else. That's my keen interest. You know, with respect to Heaney, I'm trying to understand his poetry better. But again, it's the person that is ultimately, I feel that impulse to learn about them. And then I suppose as a result of that, naturally, I'll understand the work a bit better. When we look at Seamus Heaney, my brother went to visit his grave, and he has that wonderful line on his tombstone, you know, "Walk on air against your better judgment." And this kind of relates to something that you've said about Heaney and his character. You know, he had wrote a poem about his brother. I think his brother was called Hugh, who had epilepsy. But this particular poem is written about his brother. The poem's called "Keep Going." And Hugh, his brother, mentions that it was heartwarming that even with all his stratospheric success, that his feet never left the ground, which I thought was a wonderful thing to say about him. You know, here you have Heaney telling us to walk on air against your better judgment, but his whole life he was fully grounded. And that, again, touches upon stuff that you've said about him, that he was accessible, he was our Seamus, effectively. So he never lost sight of himself, which I think is a wonderful character trait. And is that something that, and a reason in particular, that why his poetry and him as a person resonates so much with us?
I would say so. You know, we were talking earlier about the claims that Heaney was a coward, you know, when he left the North for Wicklow in 1972. But the thing that has always struck me as, again, you know, you ask yourself, what would you have done this moment? Is that on the day that he died, whenever he was being brought into the hospital in Dublin, he, on the stretcher, he texted his wife, Marie, "Nole tolemare," which is Latin for "do not be afraid." And you sit and think about your final moments. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was comforting his wife. Now that to me is the measure of the man. That to me is, if you could do that, you're thinking with your loved ones, not yourself in your final moments, then these claims of cowardice, you know, are irrelevant for me. And that's, you know, that's to me is like, that's bravery. And of course, you know, what's also brave is that, like, we've been talking about Yeats and Joyce and how confident they were. And you know, Heaney, why he was tentative about speaking for his nation or his tribe, whatever that might be, he definitely had the confidence to quit Queen's, and he definitely said, "I'm going to make it as a poet." As you know, we've been talking about this, about how difficult it is to get young people interested in reading more. He made his living through his poetry and, you know, through lectureships, you know, giving talks. So by, as you mentioned there, his stratospheric success, whenever he wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, he's like a global rock star when it comes to poetry, you know. And it's one of the things, like, you know, even people then thought, you know, it's impossible to make a living off poetry, but it is still possible. You know, each generation thinks, oh, you know, it's we're worse off than we were than the previous generation when it comes to the arts and stuff like that. You know, people were saying that in the 1960s whenever Heaney was starting out, because by that time, you know, you have, you know, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, they've almost there in their latter years, and it's like poetry seems to be you know, modernist poetry seems to be at its end. But he just comes along as just, you know, throughout his life, as we said, he walked on there against his better judgment. He said, I'm going to write about my own life. And people just, followed him along the way, So I do feel like as if he set his own path, and that's something to be admired, whatever it might be. You mightn't say, "Oh, today I'm going to become a poet," but it's just this. We can all admire this of whatever it is you choose to be. He saw it through, He kept doing it, I'm sure his children would say to you like how he was locked away in his little office writing each day, So it's something he tackled with, something he had to confront with each day. These poems didn't just drop out of the air. They weren't delivered by the fairies, to go back to Yeats. He had to work on it day by day, line by line, And
Yeah.
that, I suppose, takes bravery, because there's nothing worse than, say, a blank page or something, the tyranny of the blank page, as they call it,
I'd watched an earlier interview of Heaney's, and for the life of me, I've tried to find it since and I can't. But he had said something that struck me first as not odd, but something I'd never thought of before. He said that poetry happens at the edges of life. And my impression of Heaney the poet, and granted, I was relatively young at the height of his success, but my impression of the poet was that from waking hour to sleeping hour, he lived and breathed and wrote poetry. But in truth, he was a family man, a husband, a father. He held down a job. Granted, this is an older interview that goes back quite some time, but he was lecturing at Queen's. He was teaching, and quite literally, poetry was happening at the edges, the fringe of his life. Because life gets in the way. So that was interesting to me, and I suppose it is true. My impression of Yeats is that he dedicated effectively every waking hour to writing. And perhaps Heaney didn't have that luxury because he had a wife and children. But remarkable that he still had the gift and the ability and the means to achieve what he had achieved. When we look at poetry in particular, and this relates to a quote I've heard from another poet, someone I think I've seen briefly in an interview, an English poet called Simon Armitage. But he talks about poetry having a relatively small audience in the general scheme of things, because it's not for everybody. Me and you might appreciate it, but we might be the 2 out of 10 people that have an interest. But he, I guess, equates poetry to shouting down a lavatory. That's how he tries to depict it in terms of how much it resonates with a wider audience. What for you stands in the way from poetry being more widely read or accepted?
That's a very interesting question. I think it goes back to what I was alluding to earlier, is that with, you think about, the different ages of history. You think like the printing press, industrial age. This here, of course, is the internet age. Mm-hmm. This here conversation is facilitated through the internet, the electronic age, whatever you want to call it. And I do think that it has, we're talking, artificial intelligence has been talked about, recent years, Elon Musk and all this, and is that a threat to humanity? But we're almost through the internet. We are, like, I would say, our brains are almost being rewired, in a sense. I feel like as if, a poem, any decent poem should be read slowly and carefully. It might take you time and time again, rereading after rereading, to even scratch the surface of what the poem means.
Do you think
Or
that's in part a deterrent for some people, that poetry is very often maybe cryptic?
yeah, I think that could put off people from poetry, as well as that. I'm not saying anything against the education system, but you know, the stereotypical classroom of poetry is, let's just read these words that many of us don't understand. We're not going to go in depth, and we're just going to write down, this is a simile, this is where you compare one thing, this is a metaphor, and so on. Whereas, you should just sit and ask people the first thing they read, when they read a poem, what did you feel? Did you understand? Why did you understand? Do you not like it? Why do you not like it? It's like, if you have these extreme emotions, go with them. Why did you like this? What did you see? Is there any lines that stick in your head? Why did they stick in your head? Why did the poet decide to put these words in this fashion? And it's tough. You spend, you look at some, it spends, many, many years looking at poetry or whatever it might be, whatever form of art, and you feel like maybe you've got it all wrong. Whereas, at the flick of a switch or flick of this here, I can scroll through Netflix and like you pretty much have it then and there. Like there's, I'll be guilty of it as well. I admit that as much as the next person, that rather than sit down and read a good book, you're like, oh, I'll just scroll through Netflix, spend more time scrolling or something, actually sticking something on,
Yeah.
I think that plays its part. Definitely, I do think that the internet has a lot to answer for as well,
Yeah, I was trying to understand, given that poet's comment, and talking about how audiences and poetry, the audience is typically quite small. And I was trying to think, how could you better engage people with poetry? I mean, time is something, obviously, people, I don't know if they're busier or just distracted, but to give yourself to poetry will require time. It's not as fluid as sitting down to a Dan Brown book and just reading. With poetry, it asks a little bit more of us. You have to kind of try and decipher, break through the top surface and understand what lies beneath. And I guess people, in many ways, don't want to. It requires effort. And I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I mean, when I look at my experiences, I had an English teacher in the Abbey, Mr. Mooney, and he was teaching us John Keats, and he had read, first and foremost, he had read the poem before we even began to strip it apart. But he had read this poem by Keats called "An Ode to a Grecian Urn." And here I am at maybe 16, and first and foremost, I don't know what a Grecian urn is, and so it was only after he had stripped it down into its component parts that I was like, oh my God, that's incredible what the poet's done there. But again, it takes time and effort. Yeah, I mean, I have an appreciation for it, and Heaney in particular. Again, like yourself, we're from the north, where myself and perhaps yourself are from a nationalist background, so there's that element to it. But again, I think helping to understand Heaney and appreciate him is the fact, like I've said earlier, he's accessible. He's right there. I can get him at the drop of a hat. And not only is it the accessibility of him reading his poetry, but explaining it to you, which helps you better understand and appreciate it. If we can move away from them just to finish, I want to understand it with respect to yourself. Going forward, obviously, at the moment, you're, I guess, in many ways, in a very privileged position that you work in the library and that you're trying to engage more and more people into it. I think making those kind of talks available is a wonderful thing. It's something that I would appreciate and love to attend. And the more varied and diverse they are, the better. Because not Heaney, for example, won't appeal to everybody, but something else might. So I think that's a wonderful thing that you're doing. But aside from the academic and stuff like that, what is another passion of yours that you would hope to pursue, or something that you would hope to accomplish?
Well, I definitely like to travel more. I definitely see more of the world. Um, but as well as that, I feel like at this moment, I've in a good way, in a very good way, I don't know what the future holds, kind of thing.
Mhm.
You know, like whenever I started, I didn't know I'd be giving these talks. I didn't know I was even, to do it. Like, as you said, get noticed by yourself on this podcast. I had no idea that this, where this would lead. You know what I mean? It's just like I'm always just keen to see what's going to happen next. But like, you know, apart from academia, having stayed at Netflix, I'm interested as much in the TV shows as anyone else. Um, I like reading things, not just academic things as
Mm.
well. It could be like fantasy or a latest crime novel, whatever that might be. I just always you can't beat a good book in my estimation. It doesn't
Oh,
have to be
absolutely.
John Keats
Yeah,
or
yeah.
Seamus. You know, um, like even my spare time, I even like read articles say about what people have. There's always something new to say about Heaney or Shakespeare. And I read that in my spare time as really as sad as that might sound. You know, um, but also like meeting up with friends as well. It's a simple pleasures in life. I'm not a
Absolutely.
complicated man.
Yeah.
But that's
All,
what.
all, all too often, I think we get caught up in the hustle and bustle, but it's those quiet moments of, whether it be introspection or just a moment of contentedness or contentment is, is a true pleasure. Um, I mean, it was something I had posted online not in response to the talk you were about to give, but I guess I had messaged. I don't know if it was the library or yours, probably not yourself, but it was probably the post from the library. I'd asked, would it be possible, or would this talk be streamed live?
Mhm.
Is that something you would consider for you know
It's
someone that lives abroad?
Yes, it's definitely if there's an interest in it, I definitely would be keen to do something along those lines. Like a stream talk or in a different location, somewhere bigger. It's just I've definitely been thinking about that. Like very recently, I've come across Paddy Colvin. You ever heard of him?
No,
Oh, you should definitely look into Paddy Colvin.
actually,
So he
I think I might have actually. Is it relating to Michael Collins? Is it?
Yes, yes. So
Okay.
Paddy Cullen, he's from down south, and what he goes on tour where he will give funny, irreverent, sort of very fast paced, very informative talks in the likes of historical figures, whether that be Michael Collins or Wolfe Tone. And I've seen him twice now. I've seen him once in Belfast, and one very recently in Bellini's here in Newry, where he gave a talk of Michael Collins. And not to sound too big headed, but I was just like sitting there thinking like this is something I could try and do myself.
Mhm.
And Blaine's just like, here he is talking to a room full of people. And I'm thinking just like, yeah, why not me? Because like, I discovered Paddy Colvin during COVID and I actually was talking to and fro him on Twitter. And like, that's for me. That's the only time he started because he started off as a musician, just playing music. He was playing in the Late Late Show. He actually was the band in the Late Late Show. But he also just had this abiding interest in Irish history.
Mhm.
And during COVID, like many people, he wasn't making a single cent of money. So he decided to post these videos online. I came across them, and now that everything's opened up again, he's taking us on tour. So I'm, almost thinking, he's got the Irish history. Maybe could I get the literature side, the
I
business
mean,
mind
that's
cooking,
the you have a wealth of knowledge, and I mean, as it relates to Irish writers, I mean, take your pick. You could do a tour on each of them, I would imagine. Um, but that I would be excited for that. And I don't think, I mean, when we look culturally and at Newry, it has a very good arts and drama um, culture. I mean, obviously, it could be much better. I think Newry's entitled to a state of the art facility that can accommodate those kind of things. But the likes of what you're doing, giving those talks in Heaney, those are something myself and like my brother and some other friends and that would love to go to. And I'm not sure that Newry Library caters to that kind of thing. I would imagine they have some stuff off, but uh, um, I think you're definitely onto something.
Yeah, it's definitely something I love to try out. And, I'd even thought of giving talks on not just Irish writers. Like a writer that I've really been fascinated with recently would be the poet John Milton. And if anyone's even familiar with him, he's sort of seen as this large figure, like, second only to Shakespeare, not only in his, importance in the academic world, but also at how difficult he is to understand because he was writing 400 years ago. But I say he's interesting to me for so many reasons. He was around the 1600s, during the English Civil War, and he actually, at some point, he actually advocated for the English to starve Irish people. Like he was around the same time as Oliver Cromwell, which of course many of us will, see that as, like revile him. But the joke I always make is that he's a good Republican in the sense that he helped behead the king, King Charles I. And what I find so remarkable about him is that, he was part of the English Parliament with Oliver Cromwell, but he lived after that and the return of King Charles II. And John Milton had to go on the run for his life, even though at this time he was completely blind. He did end up in prison, but whenever he came out, he wrote Paradise Lost, which when I first encountered it, I didn't understand any two words together because he was able, like he basically took all of literature and all of scripture, like something that Joyce would have balked at, and he put it in like remarkable, absolutely remarkable poetry. And I feel like as if I would love to try and bring him to more wider audience. I feel like he's definitely, to me, in terms of just sheer poetic mastery, I think he's second to none. And just such an interesting life too. Like in his early 20s, John Milton said, "I'm going to write something that future generations will not willingly let die." And here we are 400 years later. It's like, not only did you have the confidence that says young man, but he also delivered. But the thing is that it was 40 years after he said the fact. So it's always, you might feel like, many people, listen, or many people, think, oh, when am I going to do that thing I want to do? And people like John Milton, or even as crazy, Colonel Sanders, whenever he started KSC in his 60s, it's like, it doesn't matter. It's like, as long as you don't lose that, motivation, as long as you don't lose that desire, it's never too late, I feel.
I think you could be to literature what Neil deGrasse Tyson and Brian Cox are to physics. And I think if you willingly do all the hard work and decipher these and bring it and make it understandable for the rest of us, I think there's an audience for it. Absolutely. I mean, there's obviously Milton the poet, but even in that brief description of his life, I'm already interested. It's compelling, and I want to understand more. And that's the joy of it. I think there's definitely a market for that. I mean, I would even suggest, your own YouTube channel or whatever it might be, start your own social media and try and create a platform. And when you see that perhaps you've garnered interest, then, start taking that on the road, perhaps,
Oh yeah, like the mindset I always have is that, not take a library, for example, or anywhere, or a bookstore. Not every book is going to be a gem, right? We've all you've read a book, or you've watched a TV show, movie, or whatever, a YouTube video, and you think, by God, that was awful. And you can sort of think, well, I can do something as awful as that in a way. If he can get that published out there, if he can get that out there, so can I. And some people might think, oh, maybe this actually isn't awful. People might say, no, this is actually, there's something in this, but, if movies like The Human Centipede can be made, if, Snakes on a Plane, someone greenlit this, it's like, well, you just got to keep knocking on that door. As I was saying, like whenever I would contact people, it's like, they might say no, they might never even reply to you, but it's like, as long as you can say, at least I tried,
Absolutely. That's the very least, or the best that you can do is just try. I don't know if you've ever taken the tour of Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin. It's a wonderful tour, but they, I think, every day have a reenactment of the oration at O'Donovan Ross's grave by Padraig Pearse. And day on day, people show up to see it and see it and see it. I mean, when it resonates with someone and people, they will ultimately flock to it. So I think what you do and what you hope to perhaps do, you will ultimately get attention and interest. And I, for one, would love to be a part of it, to watch it, because I'm always reminded of. I don't know. It's a quote, but I can't attribute it to anybody in particular. But it was my brother that ultimately told me the quote. But the beginning of knowledge is inquiry. It's just that initial curiosity. And it's amazing when you're curious and you're hungry for knowledge. There's an immense amount of knowledge out there, and you just got to find what interests you. Like yourself, I have an interest in literature and history, but I thoroughly enjoyed. And here we are. I've learned something new today. I felt, in some respects, unqualified. Here I am talking to a gentleman with a PhD in English literature, and I got a C in A-level English literature. I ultimately did better in my history, but I think in many respects, English literature and history can run parallel, because, I mean, if you look at what Heaney did for the Troubles, in some respects, W.B. Yeats did for the Rising and that period of history. But I want to thank you. I've taken up perhaps enough of your time.
Well, I want to thank you, Damien. And, you're talking also to a man who got a C in GCSE English literature. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll say you got the ego, you got to put it to one side, There it was. That's what happened to me and what I went on to do. But, you always, as long as you always have that curiosity, as you were saying, it just takes time. You don't become smarter. It takes, like Heaney or whoever you want to say, it's time and effort. You actually sit down and take it day by day, whatever that topic might be, or it's Heaney, the Roman Empire, whatever it is, it's just like, right, as I always say, what can I do today? Let's start this book, this chapter, and then slowly but surely, you like that frog, you just keep heating up, keep getting more knowledge, hopefully.
Just one last question. As it relates to any other potential talks that you might give going forward, do you have any other topic or person in mind that you would like to?
Well, we mentioned them already, but the name that does get thrown about is Oscar Wilde.
Okay.
Because you were saying earlier about, the man and the poet. Well, I think in Oscar Wilde's case, too often, like he has such a fascinating biography. It is fascinating. Well, if I were, hopefully to give a talk on Oscar Wilde in the future, I do want to show that, yes, he does have an interest, but he also is a great artist as well. Like sometimes, I mentioned the picture of Dorian Gray, where this man has a portrait, and every time he commits like some sort of sin, the portrait gets uglier, but he stays beautiful. And of course, everyone says, oh, this is obviously, a reference to Oscar Wilde's, hidden homosexuality. And I was like, I don't want to always, that's the problem with Oscar Wilde criticism. They always look to that there. I always feel like, it's the example I use. If you had we discovered tomorrow, a piece of paper says, I'm gay, signed William Shakespeare, and every piece of work would always be out there. I was like, yes, it is. I agree with you. It is, helpful to know the artist's life and background, but also there's a bit more, it is fiction in a way as well. They are creating something imaginative, and that's what I would try and bring to the fore if I were to do a talk on Oscar Wilde. I was like, yes, I can't ignore his life, but I also just like to show you this is why he's also a great writer in his own respect, irrespective of his own, background or his own life and so on, so he's definitely the name that's been thrown about.
Well, there you go. The gauntlet's been laying down for you, so I'd be keen to listen to that. And if there were an opportunity that you would stream it live, I'll tune in.
Well, thank you very much, Damien. I really enjoyed this.
Niall, absolutely, it's been a pleasure. I came very much as the student, hoping to learn something from the teacher. I have an interest in it, but I've never specialized in literature. But nevertheless, I still pursue knowledge, and I'm always curious. So it's been a joy. Thank you.